Hey everyone, welcome back to another mining chamber video. In today's video, we are going to take a deep dive regarding to overclocking your GPUs for mining, and as well as all the settings and what they mean. And then we're also going to talk about BIOS modding and how overclocking and BIOS modding benefits you for mining and whether you should be doing it or not. So there will be a lot of information that will be helpful for newcomers to mining, but in general, this topic is very important for mining, so I do recommend watching this video. Now let's get started right after the intro. The first thing I want to go over is overclocking, but before I do that, I want to tell you guys, if you're confused about this topic, don't worry at all. I think this is the one topic that everyone has a hard time understanding, unless you're an extreme genius and you got it right off the bat. So just bear with me in this video, and then hopefully after this video, all the confusion will be gone. So now let me just define to you what overclocking is. Overclocking, in general terms, it's basically pushing your GPU outside its normal limits. So you're going to be putting the overclocks higher by pushing your core clock higher, or memory clock, which we will describe what these terms are, and that would help you achieve more FPS if you're playing video games or such. So that is the general term of overclocking, but for us miners, we look at it differently. We don't try to push our cards higher, but instead we would try to reduce the power that they use. But with that, we also try to push a little bit on performance, but our main focus is reducing the power consumption of the GPU. Now let me tell you why it's important to do that. Power consumption means how much power your GPU is drawing, and the more power that your GPU will take, the more heat it will generate. So energy equals heat. Now by reducing the power intake of your GPU, that means you will reduce the heat of your GPU, and what heat is known for is killing your hardware. So the hotter your hardware gets, the faster it will die on you. Now that's why overclocking for miners, we would try to push down as much power as possible, and then we would try to get as much performance by using that limited power that we have. So your goal as a miner is to find the most efficient settings which will give you the most hash rate per watt. Now if you have free electricity and you want to push your cards a little bit further, then you can. Just try to avoid making your cards run as hot as possible, and then I'll also talk to you guys about the temperatures and what are some safe temperatures you can keep your GPUs under. So now I hope you guys understand what overclocking is for miners and what our goal is. Now for gamers, like I mentioned before, you would try to push your settings more for FPS rather than more hash rate, which will be different than your mining overclocks. So whatever overclock settings you guys use for mining, it probably won't be efficient for gaming, because different algorithms in mining focus on different parts of the GPU. So for example, mining Ethereum would focus more on your memory clock because it is a memory intensive algorithm, but if you're mining Kapow, which is a core intensive algorithm, that means your core clock is what matters. So that's why you'll notice a lot of people that mine Ethereum, they would put their core clock as low as possible, and then they would put their memory clock as high as possible to achieve max efficiency. And if you want to mine coins such as Raven coin that run on the Kapow algorithm, then you'd have to increase your core clock and reduce your memory, or increase your memory slightly to achieve full efficiency on that algorithm. And there are also GPUs that you can buy that are pre-overclocked, so such as the Sapphire 5700 XT BE edition and gaming OC cards. So these GPUs are overclocked by the manufacturer themselves, so that doesn't benefit you in any way if you're mining, because it's mostly overclocked for gamers, not miners. And I wouldn't recommend paying more for an overclocked card because you can just simply change the settings yourself. But then there are also cards such as the 3060 Ti or the 3060 regular or 1660 supers and such. These cards are different because you're able to push them further than the regular model or the different variation. So in that case, it would matter. For example, the Ti would be able to push better on the core, while the super won't be able to push as much in the core clock. So now what are these terms? Core clock, memory clock, voltage, what are all these about? Let's go ahead and explain all the terms one by one and tell you what part they play in your GPU. So for the overclocked terminology, I separated them based on common settings and uncommon settings. So for the common settings, you have the ones that you will need to change based on what GPU you have, and then the uncommon settings are the ones that don't apply to all cards. Just for some GPUs you need to use them. So first let's cover the common settings terminology. We first have the core clock. Your core clock is the speed of the GPU's core. So like I mentioned before, the settings for the core clock is not important for Ethereum mining or memory intensive mining, but it is important for core intensive mining. So that is why you would push this down as much as you can. But then you also need to be careful that sometimes if you push it way too low, you can also lose performance for mining Ethereum. So you need to find the right zone for your core clock settings. And then after I cover all the terminology, I will go over finding the right spot for your settings. So for the core clock, there's also times where you have to do it as an offset rather than a fixed number. So for example, if you look at a 5700 XT overclock settings, you would have to put a fixed number, rather than an offset. And what an offset means is that you're going to do a plus 500 or a negative 500 depending on what you're overclocking it for, and that is very common with NVIDIA GPUs. With NVIDIA GPUs you would do an offset rather than a fixed number, so that is something you want to keep in mind when you're overclocking different GPUs. Now the second settings that goes hand by hand with core clock is your core voltage, and that is the main settings that us GPU miners need to focus on changing. Core voltage can also be known as VDD or power limit, even though power limit is a different setting, but it still runs the same functionality as core voltage. So what it does, it limits the amount of power that your GPU gets. So if you leave it as default, usually your GPU will take too much power for a task that it doesn't need that much power for. And by pushing your core voltage lower as well as your core clock, that means you're only going to use the bare minimum of power to finish that said so task. And just keep in mind that if you push your core voltage down without pushing your core clock down, you're most likely going to run into instability issues. So now, when do you need to focus on core voltage or power limit? That depends on your GPU. So if you're using an AMD card, you're most likely going to be changing your core voltage rather than your power limit. And remember, you only want to change one of these settings. You don't want to change both of them. So for AMD cards, it's core voltage. For NVIDIA cards, it's power limit. Core voltage would take in a number of the voltage that you want to supply your GPU. So usually you want to go 30% less than how much your GPU consumes. And for power limit, it's the same thing. So usually it's at 100%, which is max power. If you're overclocking it for gaming, you would push it a bit more. So you can say 110%. But for mining, you'd want to go down to like 60% or 70% for whatever GPU you're using. So the third term we have is memory clock. Your memory clock is what matters regarding to GPU mining Ethereum. So you try to push that as high as you can to a stable point. So what that basically does is the higher you push your memory clock, the more heat that the GPU memory chips will generate. So this settings is like the main settings that would cause you crashing or instability. So if you push your memory clock too much, then you're probably going to notice a lot of instability and a lot of crashing. And if you keep it too low, then you'll notice your hash rate is very low. So for this settings, it can also differ on different operating systems, and for NVIDIA cards it's also different. In NVIDIA cards it's still an offset just like the core clock, so you do plus 500, negative 500, but then in different operating systems it can come differently as well, which we will also cover later on. So now that we finished up the memory clock, let's talk about the temperature limit. So your temperature limit is basically a safety measurement for your GPU. So if the GPU reaches a certain temperature, then the performance would drop. To make sure that the temperature drops as well, this setting should be in the uncommon settings, but sometimes it can be useful. You can set it if your GPU goes above 90 degrees on the core, then that's going to be scary. So that's when you want your GPU to shut down or anything like that. And then finally, in the common settings, we have the fan speed. Your fan speed is your GPU fans, not your system fans, so not your external fans or anything like that. And this setting is very useful when you're having a hot GPU, so you can just pump up the fan to 100% and have them run on 100%. In general, the faster your fan runs, the faster it will wear out, but I would rather have a fan break on me rather than the GPU itself. So keeping your GPU cool should be your priority. But these fans are durable. Sometimes you'll have a bad luck with a manufacturer and get a bad fan that would break fast, but most of the time you can run these fans 100% for a year and then nothing will go bad. Although running your fan on a high speed, it will be pretty noisy, so based on your situation you should fine tune them and see what works best for you. Now let's go ahead and talk about the uncommon settings. So for the uncommon settings, we have the memory voltage, memory controller voltage, DPM, as well as the RX boost or ref. So memory voltage and memory controller voltage are settings that you don't usually have to change, but if you're mining using Hive OS, you'll notice these settings there, and usually you'd have to change the memory controller voltage. But the memory voltage itself, you can just leave it the way it is as the default value. And now remember, these are just like the core clock and the core voltage, except this time it's memory clock and memory voltage. And since we push our memory clock high, we would want to keep the voltage the way it is to make sure that your GPU can run at the speeds that you set it at. But in some cards, you can just reduce the memory controller voltage a little bit, and that would reduce your power consumption. If you hover over the tooltip information, you'll notice that they'll tell you that there's a max and a minimum for these settings. So from that, you can get a little bit of information of what your parameters are. In Windows, most of the time you don't have to change these settings, but in a Linux based mining system, you'll see these settings there. And then you have the DPM, which is also known as core state. The core state is commonly changed when it comes to Polaris or RX cards, and that just affects your power level of your GPU core. So for RX cards, you would lower the value to undervolt your GPU more, and usually just putting it as 1 or 2 would be a good option. And finally, the last option is RX boost, also known as refresh rate. So this settings can also be mentioned in the BIOS modding section because it is modifying your memory timing of your GPU, but usually you'll find the settings in Linux-based mining operating systems as an option to set where your overclocks are, so that's why I'm mentioning it here. And generally a good number for that is 20. That worked out for me for all my RX 580 cards. You might have to do a different number depending on your card. RX boost is mainly used for Polaris cards that are the 400 or 500 series, so you might not be able to use this feature on your other GPUs such as the 5700 XTs. And what it does is just makes your refresh rate of your memory timings quicker, which helps you increase your hash rate mainly on memory intensive algorithms. So now that we covered the terminology, let's go ahead and talk about overclocking in Windows 10 and what software you can use for that, as well as overclocking in Linux-based mining operating systems. And then after that, we can talk about safe temperature zones and how to find the right overclocks for your GPU. So for overclocking in Windows 10, most of the time I use MSI Afterburner. It's a very common option to use among overclockers. For MSI Afterburner to be able to change your core voltage for some GPUs, you have to allow it from the settings tab, and once you allow it there, you'll be able to change your core voltage of certain GPUs. And then for some other GPUs, you might not be able to change them, and in that case I would end up using AMD Wattman, because most of the time the cards that you can change their voltage for is the AMD card, because for Nvidia cards, like I mentioned before, you need to change their power limits, not their voltage. So in that case, I would say the top options for AMD cards is Overdrive and Tool, MSI Afterburner, and AMD Wattman. They all follow the same principles, you just need to put the values in there and then you're set. And then for Nvidia cards, I would just use MSI Afterburner all the way through. And then also one more thing you can do in Windows 10 is putting your overclocks in your mining script. So for example, Phoenix Miner would let you put in your M clock, your C clock, and everything in the script itself so that it loads it with the miner, and that's just a good way to have it running right away. I will go more over that in a tutorial regarding to Phoenix Miner that will be coming out very soon. Now for a Linux based operating system, you can just put them through the dashboard that they give you to put in your overclock settings, and then just remember that there are sometimes differences between putting your memory clock in Windows. It would be different than you putting it in a Linux based operating system, and I will talk about that more in the overclocking section for your GPU. So that is it for overclocking in Windows 10 or a Linux based mining operating system. Now let's talk about finding the right overclocks for your GPU. Finding the right overclocks for your GPU depends on three main factors. The first one is your memory type. So your memory type can differ even if you have the same exact GPU, and the most common memory types are Micron, Samsung, and Hynix. And then you also have your silicon lottery. So that silicon lottery is just your luck with the hardware that you got. Sometimes people get exceptional cards that can push really hard, and then other times you might just get unlucky and you have a card that can barely overclock. And then you also have the cooling, which depends on the model of the GPU that you have. Some models, for example EVGA, is known for their good hardware and their good cooling, but that doesn't mean the other ones are bad. It's just for certain cards there are models to avoid. And this, as well as the silicon lottery, is not a common thing, so you don't need to really worry about that much. It's just a low percentage that this would affect your GPU mining, but most of the time you don't need to worry about this as much. Just make sure you do a good research of the GPU you want to buy and see what people review and what they say they like more, and then just from there make your decision. So now back to the memory type. Some memory types can be overclocked further than others, so I would recommend checking what memory type you have, and then you can look for people that have a similar memory type to you, and then you can try their overclocks. It's completely fine to use the same overclocks as different memory types. So for example, for my 5700 XTs, I have them all on the same overclocks, and my overclocks are not that efficient, but I do rather having stable overclocks than just pushing them as much as I can to find the maximum efficiency, because having the highest uptime at the end of the day is what's more important. So now for finding the overclocks for your GPU, there's multiple different sites that will provide you overclocks. You can find some of them on miningchamber.com. So every GPU that I cover in a GPU overview video, I would put their overclocks there for the most profitable algorithm at the time. So now all the overclocks that we have in the website are for Ethash algorithm, which is memory intensive, and the values that I provide there are the stable points, so you can just put them in your GPU and they should work fine. But again, there's no guarantees. Every card is different, every GPU might react differently. So if you put these overclocks in and then you still notice like incorrect shares or your GPU is crashing on you or anything like that, just tune down your memory clock or increase your voltage by a little. So these are the two main settings you want to focus on when tuning your overclocks. So what I mean, for example, if you put your memory clock at 800, you can just try to increment it down by 5 slowly until that issue is gone. And a good rule of thumb is to have it run at least 3 days. Make sure that everything is fine after 3 days. If it is, then you can try to optimize it more, or you can just leave it the way it is. And then for core voltage, it's the same thing. So instead of going down this time, you want to go up. You want to give the card more power. So if you have 780 core voltage, you can just increase it to 785 and then 790 until you find the stable point. But just change one of these numbers at a time rather than both of them, so you know where the issue is exactly coming from. I will leave a link below for a nice hash article on finding overclocks there. They have a really nice write-up with the most common GPUs used for mining as well as their overclocks. And then if you don't find the overclocks for your GPU, then I would just do some more research, and as a final resort, just use this guide to overclock. So if you're going to mine Ethereum, start with increasing your memory clock by hundreds or any fixed number, and then just keep testing it out until you find the right point. Now let's talk about the temperatures. So for temperatures, there are two different things we need to look at. You first have your core temperature, so that's the main chip of the GPU, and then you have your memory temperatures, and those are the memory chips inside of your GPU. Generally, the core temperature should not go high when you're mining Ethereum because it's a memory intensive algorithm, so keeping it below 70 degrees would be ideal. But if you're mining something that's more core intensive, then you can see your GPU go up to 80 degrees, but try to lower it as much as you can. Keeping it below 75 is a good idea. And as for your memory temperatures, they can go up to 105 degrees Celsius. They can even go further than that, but my recommendations to you would be to keep it below 90 degrees. I know it will be hard to do with cards such as the 5700 XTs, the Mech OC edition, it does get really hot, and some other cards. Even the RTX 3000 series, we can see that their memories get really hot, that they end up throttling, which means that the GPU would boost its performance down just like a temperature limit set. And in that case, some people change their thermal pads on their GPUs, which help better the temperatures, and that's something you can do as well. Although be aware that it does void your warranty, so please be advised. So as long as your core temperature is below 70 degrees or nowhere above 80 degrees, you'll be fine. And for your memory temperature, try to keep it below 90 degrees as well. If you have to pump up the fans all the way, please do so, or you can just buy a box fan and put it next to it as well. So now we wrapped up overclocking and everything about it. So if you have any further questions about overclocking or anything that's still confusing to you, please let us know in the comments below. I'll try to answer them as best as I can. Now let's go ahead and talk about BIOS modding and when do you need to BIOS mod, as well as what is BIOS modding. So BIOS modding is changing the settings that are hard-coded into your GPU. So the way this process usually works is you would plug in your GPUs, either one at a time if you're using Windows, or you can plug them all in if you're using a Linux-based mining operating system, and then from there you can just download your original BIOS, and then you modify that original BIOS. Most of the time it's copying your 1500 timing level to the lower values, which makes your timing quicker and more efficient, which in return boosts your hash rate by about 3 to 4 mega hash based on what GPU you're BIOS modding. And then it also might lead to using slightly more power, but for the hash rate you get, it is worth it. Or sometimes it even reduces your power consumption based on what GPU you're modding. Not every GPU follows the same process for modding, but it's just the same concept. And also not every GPU needs a BIOS mod. Some of them you can't even BIOS mod them. So for example, the Nvidia cards, you don't have to touch any of their BIOS, but for AMD cards, the main ones that need a BIOS mod are the 5700 XTs, 5600 XTs sometimes if you can figure out how to go over that BIOS lock. And then there's also the Polaris cards, so the 500 and the 400 series. These as well need a BIOS mod to go from 26-27 mega hash to 30 mega hash. I will be doing a video on that very soon. The main thing you want to keep in mind when BIOS modding is making sure that you save your original BIOS. That will be important. If you ever want to use your warranty or anything like that, you need to have your original BIOS flashed on the GPU. And if you have the same GPUs, I would still recommend saving each one's individual BIOS because you might have different memory types, they might have different IDs, so please make sure you save that original BIOS. And as for flashing them, usually you'd use a tool called AMD VB Flash, and to modify the BIOS, usually use a tool that's called Red BIOS Editor. but then that all depends on which GPU you're modifying. So for example, the 5700 XT, we went step by step by using Red BIOS editor and AMD VB Flash. And then there is also More Power Tool. More Power Tool basically helps you remove restrictions to what your GPU can do. So for example, the 5700 XTs, you can't push them lower than 750 millivolts, but by modifying them with the More Power Tool, you can push them even further down, which gives you the potential of being able to undervolt even further and save more power. But then again, that can lead to instability because you're trying to push your GPU way further than it actually can. So now to wrap up the BIOS modding, do I recommend it? Yes, if you do have more than one GPU. So if you're mining with your gaming PC or your editing PC, I honestly don't recommend BIOS modding your GPU. First, you might brick your card if you do it wrong, and second, it's just not worth it for that 3 to 4 mega hash more. But if you have more than one GPU, then 100% you should do it. Now, what should you do if you brick your card? If you brick your GPU, there's multiple ways you can come out of this. And the most common way is if you have a BIOS switch on your GPU. So it's a tiny little switch you will see next to your pins, and that switch you can usually flip it from silence to performance mode. And let's say for example you were modding your BIOS and you bricked it while you're in the silence mode, you can just flip that BIOS switch to performance and then boot your mining rig again. And then after that you can flip the switch back to silence again while the computer is on, and then you can flash your original BIOS back to your GPU, and then that would put you back as brand new. And then you can check what you did wrong and redo the BIOS mod. Now if you don't have that BIOS switch, you can instead plug in your GPU and try to get the display out of your motherboard by enabling integrated graphics, or plugging in another GPU that's actually working as your primary GPU, and then just have the secondary GPU in there, and then you can just boot up and flash the secondary GPU, and then you should be good to go. Just make sure that you don't accidentally flash the primary GPU. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it and or learned something new from it, please leave a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe if you're not subscribed yet. And if you have any further questions, leave them in the comments below or join our Discord server. So thank you guys again, and I hope you have a wonderful day.